Hello, and welcome to the Come to Christ podcast. My name is Charlene Nelson, and I'd like to thank you for tuning in. Today's bite-sized devotional is part 2 of the Unity series called Church Isn't About You. Yesterday, we talked about how there are so many things to argue about in churches that you could likely never run out of reasons to argue. We touched on the hope of Christ for a unified church and how we should desire to strive for peace. Today we'll ask ourselves some perhaps uncomfortable questions. But remember that discomfort and honesty before the Lord is part of how we grow. Let's start by talking about abundant church options and spoiled believers. In much of the Western world, I would argue that Christians live in a time of excessive church options. Choosing a church can be similar to picking an ice cream flavor. To be fair, I have nothing against the existence of denominations or flavors within Christianity. With large populations, we're likely to have a greater variety of preferences and practices, and even beliefs that aren't essential to salvation. It makes sense to choose a church that aligns with your convictions closely, and doing so should aid church unity within the local body. An abundance of church options in many ways is a jaw-dropping blessing, not granted to most of the world or to Christians throughout history. However, we tend to take this blessing lightly. I would argue we've been given such an overabundance of not only churches, but also unending online resources, to the point that we are easily spoiled. And just like children who are spoiled, we can end up acting like entitled kids, craving after better ministries, preaching, and music, with people who are better at meeting our needs. So we might ask ourselves, could unity be found in denominations? While denominations or doctrinal statements can be important and helpful towards establishing unity, they are not where we ultimately find unity. Christian unity is not primarily about agreeing with each other, although that is part of it. To be clear, all Christian churches must agree on essentials of the faith, like the nature of God, the fall of man, and the gospel of our salvation, or else they are not Christian churches at all. But we must understand that even within denominations, believers are not united by shared music preferences, governance practices, or sacrament rituals. Unity isn't found in shared convictions on matters of clothing or drinking or media or who you vote for. Infant baptism, postmillennialism, Calvinism, or Pentecostalism are not your foundation. Not even a good preacher or strong leadership form the wellspring of shared lives and shared praise. I'd like to propose that Christian unity is primarily found in one place, and that's the person and work of Jesus Christ. He is the one who saved us and the one we worship. Together, we wait to know him perfectly, recognizing that none of us know him fully yet. We should be, like brothers and sisters, glorying in Christ together, patiently aiding each other to grow into his likeness. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, "We all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit." Doesn't that sound wonderful? Christology, which is understanding the nature and work of Jesus, is a bottomless well displaying the very nature of the God we come to know through him. His life, work, and words could be meditated on and shared joyously for all eternity. His atoning work also has endless depths and applications for our lives. In the life, love, personhood, and work of Christ, believers can unite and be satisfied for eternity. But what about here? What about now? Is church unity possible? I would say it is possible for believers to lay aside grievances and differences and come together in a shared love of Jesus Christ. Of course, we're never going to do that perfectly on this side of heaven as we're still sinners, but the Lord wouldn't have prayed for our unity if it were an impossible thing. In John 17:22-23, Jesus prayed, "The glory that you have given me, I have given to them, that they may be one, even as we are one. I in them, and you in me, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them even as you loved me. Through his profound love, Jesus yearned for our unity, reflecting his own unity with the Father. He sacrificed himself, not just to display his glory, but also to grant us the boundless joy and richness that comes from being unified in his love and redemption. Maybe you're listening and you're at a point that you are getting frustrated at your church, or there's things you're simply not happy about. You might be asking yourself, is it time to switch churches? So here's a few thoughts about that. You do need to find a church where the gospel is preached. The Bible is the only source of authoritative truth and where the glory of God is central. That being said, you might be in a weak church, and it could be that God has you there to strengthen it. Yet, I want to be clear. Of course, there are good reasons that you might need to divide from your church. I'm, however, of the opinion that we divorce from our churches far too easily. In doing so, we harm ourselves and the body, slowing its progress and sometimes injuring it in our haste, causing it to limp. Of course, I understand that believers can change their stance on secondary beliefs and feel pulled towards a new church that aligns with their new stance. In this case, switching churches may be beneficial. However, if this uproots you from a place where you are valued, loved, and in service to others, you have to ask, is it worth it? Will you want to do it again in 10 years when your opinions change once more? People who know me may be surprised that I have some beliefs that don't align perfectly with my church, and I'm happy to keep those thoughts mostly to myself. On a rare occasion, I may bring up my perhaps controversial opinions with a mature and trusted believer, but I'm not fixated on swaying people my direction on secondary things. As members of the local church, we have a duty to pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding, Romans 14:19. We seek to knit together and bind, to bring stability and goodness. The Lord may counsel your heart to move on, and I can't condemn that, but my caution is to approach this with careful prayer, seeking counsel from godly people who would challenge you honestly. Humble yourself, welcome critical feedback as you weigh your church options. And remember, church isn't about you. If you are tempted to sway people to your cause, have them join in your complaints, or simply to leave your church altogether, make sure you've taken time to consider one thing. Your church isn't about you. You may believe everyone would be better off conforming to your convictions and standards, but that isn't your job as a church member. The church belongs to God and exists solely for His glory. He sees fit to use weak and imperfect people, including your church leaders. Though God knows all things perfectly, He's been content to use believers with various gifts, opinions, and passions. We're not better than the Lord, and we don't deserve to have it all our way. If He is patient and long-suffering, we ought to practice the same. The same blood that covered my sin also covered my brother's and sister's sin. Who am I to destroy another for whom Christ died? 1 Corinthians 8:11. The Christian life is about living to serve others while dying to self. It isn't about merely tolerating other believers, but rather being willing to live and die for them. A very high aim would be to experience such fellowship with believers that if a day of persecution came, you would have someone to die beside. And if you could die for your faith beside someone, how could you not live your Christian life beside them? Well, that closes this episode. I don't know that many podcasters present their listeners with such convicting questions, and trust me, it's convicting for me too. But I intend to make it my aim to provide content for Christians who want to be challenged and want to grow. As this podcast is still new, I'm exploring different types of episodes, and I value your feedback. Drop a comment on YouTube, Spotify, or Facebook at Come to Christ to let me know what you think, or about other topics you might like to hear about. May the Lord be with you. Goodbye for now.